There is a subtle shift that happens in emotionally sensitive people over time. It is not sudden, it is not dramatic, and it is rarely visible to others. But internally, it changes everything. In the early stages of life, many empaths operate from emotional reactivity rather than emotional awareness. They feel deeply, but they do not always understand what they are feeling in real time. As a result, they respond instinctively. They adjust. They accommodate. They absorb the emotions, expectations, and energies of the people around them. Because they are highly attuned to emotional environments, they often prioritize harmony over self-expression. They become skilled at reading others, but not always at understanding themselves. They sense tension before anyone speaks. They notice subtle changes in tone, body language, and behavior. Yet despite this awareness, they often ignore their own emotional signals. But over time, through repeated emotional experiences, interpersonal disappointments, broken trust, and quiet moments of reflection, something fundamental begins to change. They begin to recognize patterns. They notice how certain people leave them feeling drained. They learn the difference between compassion and self-sacrifice. They discover that understanding others does not require abandoning themselves. And gradually, they stop reacting automatically. They stop explaining themselves excessively. They stop seeking validation from people who cannot truly see them. Instead, they start observing. They pause before responding. They listen to their intuition. They become more curious about what they feel and why they feel it. This shift marks the beginning of emotional intelligence in its deeper form, where awareness begins to override impulse, and perception becomes more important than approval. And this is where they slowly become harder to influence, harder to manipulate, and harder to control. Not because they are resisting others, not because they have become cold or detached, but because they are no longer abandoning themselves. And this transformation, although quiet, becomes deeply unsettling for people who are used to emotional predictability. Because the empath who once reacted now reflects. The empath who once accommodated now chooses. And the empath who once sought acceptance now values self-respect. That is when true emotional power begins to emerge. In earlier life stages, empaths often rely heavily on external emotional cues, tone of voice, facial expressions, mood shifts, approval signals, rejection signals. Because they are naturally sensitive to emotional environments, they learn to monitor the reactions of others almost constantly. Their attention becomes focused outward. They become highly skilled at detecting tension, discomfort, disappointment, or emotional change in the people around them. This creates a tendency to prioritize others' emotional states over their own internal signals. They learn to ask, "Is everyone okay? Did I upset someone? What can I do to make this situation better?" But they rarely ask themselves a different question. What am I feeling right now? As a result, many empaths spend years disconnected from their own emotional guidance system. But with time, a psychological recalibration begins. Life experiences slowly challenge old patterns. Certain relationships become exhausting. Certain environments repeatedly create anxiety. Certain people consistently leave them feeling emotionally depleted. And eventually, they start noticing something important. Their internal discomfort was not random, it was information. What they once dismissed as overthinking gradually reveals itself as pattern recognition. The uneasy feeling they experienced before being disappointed. The tension they felt before a betrayal. The exhaustion they noticed around emotionally demanding people. These experiences begin to form a recognizable pattern. And through this process, they develop a deeper level of self-awareness. This is a core principle of emotional intelligence. The ability to differentiate between emotional noise and emotional signal. Not every emotion requires a reaction, but every emotion contains information. And once this distinction becomes clear, something powerful happens. They begin to trust their internal data more than external persuasion, more than social pressure, more than guilt, more than the expectations of others, because they finally understand that their inner awareness is not a weakness. It is one of the most reliable forms of intelligence they possess. Earlier, emotional influence worked easily on them. A change in tone could create guilt. A withdrawal of attention could create anxiety. A conflict could trigger over-explanation and self-doubt. Because many empaths are highly sensitive to emotional dynamics, they often interpret interpersonal tension as something they need to fix. When someone becomes distant, they immediately search for reasons. When someone seems upset, they assume responsibility. When conflict appears, their first instinct is often self-correction rather than objective evaluation. As a result, emotional reactions happen quickly, sometimes so quickly that they occur before conscious thought has a chance to intervene. But as emotional intelligence matures, a separation begins to form between stimulus and response. This change is subtle, yet incredibly powerful. They still feel deeply. They still notice emotional shifts. They still recognize tension, disappointment, or discomfort. But they no longer immediately react. Instead, they pause internally and evaluate. Rather than absorbing every emotion around them, they begin asking different questions. What is actually happening here? Is this consistent with this person's behavior? Am I responding to facts or assumptions? Is this emotionally safe? This pause is critical, because within that pause, awareness begins to replace impulse. Observation begins to replace emotional urgency, and perception becomes stronger than reaction. They start seeing patterns that were once hidden by emotional overwhelm. They notice when guilt is being used as leverage. They recognize when silence is being used as control. They become aware of emotional inconsistencies that they previously ignored. Because manipulation does not survive reflection. It depends on immediacy. It depends on emotional reactivity. It depends on a lack of distance between feeling and action. The moment a person slows down and begins observing rather than reacting, the dynamic starts to change. And when that distance develops between emotion and behavior, influence begins to weaken. Not because the empath becomes less caring, but because they become more conscious. And conscious people are far more difficult to control than reactive ones. Pattern recognition over excuses. A key developmental shift in emotionally intelligent individuals is the transition from isolated interpretation to pattern-based understanding. Earlier, each incident is evaluated separately. Maybe this time was different. Maybe there was a reason. Maybe they were having a bad day. Maybe I misunderstood. Because emotionally sensitive people often lead with empathy, they naturally search for explanations before conclusions. They try to understand circumstances. They consider context. They give people the benefit of the doubt. And while empathy is a valuable strength, it can sometimes create a blind spot. The focus becomes centered on understanding behavior rather than evaluating it. As a result, individual incidents are often viewed in isolation. A broken promise becomes an exception. A moment of disrespect becomes a misunderstanding. A repeated disappointment becomes something that can still be explained away. But over time, something begins to change. Experience starts connecting the dots. The mind gradually shifts from examining isolated events to observing recurring patterns. And this is where emotional intelligence begins operating at a higher level. Because healthy perception is not built from single moments. It is built from consistency across time. The emotionally mature empath starts asking different questions. Not, what did they say? But, what do they consistently do? Not, what was their intention? But, what is the outcome of their behavior? Consistency becomes more important than intention. Behavior becomes more important than explanation. Actions become more informative than promises. And once pattern recognition activates, emotional confusion reduces significantly. because the mind is no longer trapped inside endless analysis. It is no longer trying to decode every individual interaction. Instead, it begins to observe the larger picture, the repeated cycles, the recurring behaviors, the predictable outcomes. The question changes from "what did they mean" to "what do they repeatedly do?" And that shift changes everything. Because patterns reveal what isolated incidents often hide. Patterns expose contradictions. Patterns reveal reliability. Patterns uncover emotional truth. And when people begin trusting patterns more than excuses, their vulnerability to emotional distortion decreases significantly. They stop getting lost in explanations and start paying attention to evidence. Boundaries in early emotional development are often emotional reactions. They appear after exhaustion, after disappointment, after emotional overwhelm. Many empaths do not establish limits until they have already been hurt. They tolerate uncomfortable situations for too long. They ignore warning signs. They convince themselves to be patient, understanding, and accommodating. As a result, boundaries often emerge as emergency responses rather than intentional choices. They are created after emotional damage has already occurred. But in later stages of emotional growth, something important changes. Boundaries stop being emotional reactions and become cognitive decisions. Instead of reacting after harm occurs, the individual begins to define internal limits beforehand. They start asking questions such as, "What am I willing to accept? What consistently drains my energy? What behaviors create emotional instability in my life? What situations require distance rather than involvement?" These questions shift boundaries from emotion into awareness, and this shift is significant, because healthy boundaries are not walls. They are forms of psychological organization, not as punishment, not as rejection, but as psychological protection. The emotionally intelligent person understands that every interaction carries an emotional cost. Some interactions create growth. Others create confusion, stress, and depletion. This is a sign of emotional maturity.
What's it called?
The ability to anticipate
It's
emotional
called a
cost
local.
before engaging in
It's
interaction.
fragmented.
Rather than repeatedly
local.
entering harmful dynamics
Is
and
it
hoping for
sweet
different
or-
outcomes, they
It's
begin making
both.
conscious
It can
choices
be
about where their emotional
sweet or
energy is invested.
salty.
And once
And
boundaries
sometimes
become
it comes
internalized,
with a
they no
spicy
longer
sauce.
require constant
Spicy.
explanation.
Mhm.
They no longer depend on approval. They no longer require others to agree with them. They simply
Yeah,
exist
there's
as
plenty
part of
plenty
self-regulation,
in the local
a
supermarket
quiet
that
but
you can
stable
pick up.
system that protects
It
emotional
really
well-being.
is wonderful.
This reduces
They've
emotional
got such a
dependency.
variety there.
It decreases the need for external
Then
validation,
you've got
and it
to try
increases
strawberry
psychological stability.
Pop-Tarts.
Because the individual is no
Strawberry.
longer relying on others to protect their
Blueberry
peace,
Pop-Tarts are
they have
the
learned
best
how to
ones.
protect it themselves. In earlier emotional stages, validation plays a central role in self-perception. Being understood feels necessary for emotional safety. Being approved of feels necessary for identity stability. Many empaths spend years unconsciously measuring themselves through the reactions of others. A compliment can elevate their confidence. A criticism can create self-doubt. Acceptance feels reassuring. Rejection feels deeply personal. Because their emotional awareness is directed outward, they often look to other people to confirm their value, intentions, and worth. They seek reassurance. They seek agreement. They seek evidence that they are enough. And while this desire is completely human, it can also create emotional vulnerability. Because anything that depends on external approval remains vulnerable to external control. But over time, emotionally intelligent individuals begin to notice a deeper reality. The opinions people hold are often reflections of their own experiences, fears, limitations, expectations, and emotional states. What one person admires, another may criticize. What one person appreciates, another may misunderstand. And this leads to a critical realization. External validation is inconsistent and often influenced by others' emotional limitations. It is not a reliable foundation for self-worth. As this understanding develops, their center of gravity begins to shift inward. They become less concerned with being universally understood, less focused on gaining approval from everyone around them, and more interested in living in alignment with their own values and awareness. Self-reference becomes stronger than social reference. Instead of constantly asking, "What do they think of me?" they begin asking, "What do I think of myself? Am I acting in alignment with my values? Am I being honest with myself?" This creates emotional independence, not isolation. Not emotional detachment, but internal stability. A stability that remains intact even when approval is absent. And this stability makes them significantly less controllable through praise, criticism, approval, or disapproval. Because their sense of worth is no longer being managed by the opinions of others. It is being guided by a deeper relationship with themselves. At this stage, something interesting happens in social environments. The individual is no longer easily provoked into emotional escalation. Situations that once triggered immediate reactions now receive thoughtful observation. Comments that once created defensiveness no longer carry the same emotional weight. Disagreements no longer automatically become personal threats. And criticism is no longer treated as proof of inadequacy. This does not mean the person has stopped feeling. In fact, they often remain deeply aware of emotional dynamics. The difference is that awareness is no longer followed by automatic reaction. They do not over-explain. They do not endlessly defend their intentions. They do not chase understanding from people who have repeatedly chosen misunderstanding. And they do not seek resolution from emotionally unsafe dynamics. This represents a significant shift in emotional intelligence. Because emotional maturity is not measured by how strongly a person feels, it is measured by how consciously they respond to what they feel. As this change develops, social interactions begin to feel different, not only for the individual, but also for the people around them. To others, this new behavior can feel unfamiliar, sometimes even confusing, because many social interactions are built on emotional feedback loops. One person reacts, the other responds. One person withdraws, the other pursues. One person criticizes, the other defends. Reaction, reassurance, conflict, resolution. These patterns often become predictable systems of interaction. But when one side stops participating in that loop, something unexpected happens. The system destabilizes. The familiar emotional rhythm no longer functions in the same way. Attempts to provoke a reaction receive calm observation. Attempts to create guilt receive thoughtful evaluation. Attempts to generate emotional urgency are met with patience rather than panic. And this often creates discomfort in people who are accustomed to emotional predictability, not because the individual is doing something aggressive, not because they have become cold, not because they have stopped caring, but because they are no longer emotionally available for influence. Their emotions are no longer easily redirected by pressure, approval, criticism, or manipulation. And when emotional self-regulation becomes stronger than emotional reactivity, social perception changes. Others begin to see a person who is calmer, more grounded, and more difficult to control. Not through resistance, but through awareness. And awareness quietly changes every interaction it touches. Empaths do not become hard to control by resisting others. They do not become powerful through emotional walls. They do not become emotionally intelligent by shutting down their feelings. In fact, the opposite is often true. Their growth comes from developing a deeper understanding of themselves. Over time, they learn to observe their emotions without being ruled by them. They learn to listen to their intuition without confusing it with fear. They learn to recognize emotional patterns without becoming trapped inside them. And through this process, something remarkable happens. Their emotions are still present. Their sensitivity remains. Their empathy remains. Their awareness increases. But what changes is the relationship between feeling and action. Earlier in life, emotions often dictated behavior. A feeling of guilt created compliance. A fear of rejection created self-abandonment. A desire for approval created people-pleasing. But emotional maturity changes that relationship. The individual begins to create space between what they feel and what they choose to do. And within that space, wisdom begins to develop. They no longer confuse emotional intensity with truth. Because not every strong feeling reflects reality. They no longer confuse attention with value. Because being noticed is not the same as being respected. They no longer confuse familiarity with safety. Because some of the most familiar patterns are also the most unhealthy. Instead, they begin evaluating experiences through awareness rather than emotional urgency. And this is the core of emotional intelligence. Not suppression of emotion, not avoidance of emotion, not becoming detached from emotion, but integration of emotion with awareness. The ability to feel deeply while thinking clearly. The ability to remain compassionate while maintaining boundaries. The ability to stay connected to others without becoming disconnected from oneself. And when that happens, something fundamental changes. External influence loses much of its power. Manipulation loses its effectiveness. Approval loses its control. Fear loses its authority. Because what once depended on external direction now operates from internal understanding. What once searched constantly for answers outside now possesses clarity within. And that may be the greatest transformation of all. Not becoming less emotional, but becoming emotionally aware enough that your emotions serve your life rather than control it. Because when self-awareness becomes stronger than external influence, control becomes unnecessary. What once needed external direction now has internal clarity.